There is a moment in history when everything changes, not slowly, not gradually, not over decades of war and politics and shifting tides, but in a single night, a single decision, a single act of betrayal so devastating that it erased 1,500 years of civilization before the sun came up. Most betrayals in history are complicated, ambiguous, built from fear, from greed, from slow erosion of loyalty. But the one we are going to talk about tonight was clean, deliberate, and it worked perfectly. On the night of September 22nd, 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. But that is not the betrayal I am talking about. I am talking about a different night, a night that historians have quietly argued about for centuries, a night when the people who should have saved an empire chose not to, when the gates that should have stayed locked were opened, when the allies who swore oaths stood back and watched. I am talking about the night the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, the civilization that had outlasted every barbarian kingdom, that destroyed its Western twin, the empire that had stood for over 1,000 years, was handed to its enemies, not by force alone, but by the deliberate choices of the people who were supposed to protect it. Only, this is not just a story about military defeat. This is a story about what human beings do when they decide that their own survival is worth more than everything they were trusted to defend. Stay with me, because nothing about this is simple and nothing about it is finished. To understand the betrayal, you have to understand what was being betrayed. The Byzantine Empire should not have existed in 1453. By any rational calculation, it should have been gone centuries earlier. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, under the weight of successive barbarian invasions, the eastern half kept going. Constantinople, built by Emperor Constantine the Great on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, became the new Rome. And unlike the old Rome, it held. It held against the Persians, it held against the Arabs, it held against the Bulgars and the Rus and the Normans and the Seljuk Turks. It lost territory, always, but it held. There was a catastrophe in 1204 that the empire never fully recovered from. And that catastrophe was not inflicted by any Eastern enemy. It was inflicted by the Fourth Crusade. Western Christian knights, who had sworn to fight in the Holy Land, instead turned their armies on Constantinople. They sacked the city, they stole its treasures, they set up a Latin empire in the heart of the Byzantine world. The Byzantine Empire was driven into exile. For 57 years, it existed only in fragments, in the small successor state of Nicaea and the despotate of Epirus. And then, in 1261, the Byzantines took Constantinople back. That recovery is one of the most remarkable comebacks in the history of any civilization. And for the next 2 centuries, the empire persisted, smaller every decade, poorer every decade, surrounded by enemies on every side, but persisting. And by the time Mehmed II came to power in 1451, the Byzantine Empire was a city-state masquerading as an empire, Constantinople and a few scattered territories, an emperor with no army worth the name, no treasury, and a population that had been declining for generations. What the Byzantines had was geography and walls. Waitemus, the Lanatholatian walls, were the greatest land fortification in the medieval world. 3 concentric layers, outer wall, and a massive inner keep, stretching for nearly 4 miles across the peninsula that Constantinople occupied. The walls had never been breached by direct assault. Every enemy who had tried to take Constantinople by force had failed. The city had only ever fallen once, to the Fourth Crusade, and that had been accomplished through treachery and a catastrophic miscalculation, not through any breach in the walls themselves. This is the inheritance that Constantine XI Palaiologos received when he became emperor in 1449. An empire in name only, walls that were still extraordinary, and a set of alliances that were about to reveal themselves as something far more dangerous than useless. They were a trap. The story of Byzantine diplomacy in its final decades is one of the most painful things in the historical record, because the Byzantines were desperately seeking allies, and the allies they found were, almost without exception, either unwilling to help or actively contributing to the empire's destruction. Let us start with Venice. Let us start with Venice. Venice and Constantinople had a long and complicated relationship. The Venetians had been given extraordinary trading privileges in Constantinople centuries earlier, privileges so extensive that they had become the dominant commercial power in the city. Venetian merchants controlled key sectors of the Byzantine economy. But when the crisis came, when Mehmed II began his preparations for the final siege, Venice moved slowly, too slowly. The Venetian Senate debated and deliberated and sent letters and made calculations about what intervention would cost. They did send ships eventually. Some Venetian sailors fought bravely in the defense of the city. But the large-scale relief fleet that Constantinople needed, the fleet that could have challenged Ottoman naval supremacy in the Bosphorus, that fleet was endlessly promised and never delivered. The Venetians had a trading post in the Ottoman world too, and they had done the math. Constantinople was probably lost. Better to maintain relations with the victor than sacrifice too much for the loser. Then there was Genoa. The Genoese had their own colony in Constantinople, the district of Galata, just across the Golden Horn from the main city. And the Genoese were in an impossible position. Their colony depended on Ottoman goodwill as much as Byzantine goodwill. They could not afford to fully commit to either side, so they committed to neither. The Genoese colony of Galata maintained a policy of official neutrality throughout the siege. They did not open their harbor to Ottoman ships directly, but they did not prevent Ottoman ships from passing. They did not fully join the Byzantine defense. And critically, this is the detail that historians have argued about for 500 years. There is evidence that some Genoese merchants were actively trading with the Ottoman camp throughout the siege, selling supplies, selling information, choosing commerce over civilization. But the deepest betrayal of all came from within the Byzantine establishment itself. His name was Loukas Notaras. Loukas Notaras was the Megas Dou, the highest naval commander of the Byzantine Empire. He was the second most powerful official in Constantinople after the emperor himself. He was wealthy, well-connected, and by every account an extremely capable administrator and politician. He was also the man who made famous one of the most extraordinary statements in Byzantine history. When the question of the church union with Rome came up, Constantine X's desperate attempt to buy Western military support by ending the Great Schism between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity. Notaras publicly and loudly opposed it. His exact words, as recorded by multiple contemporary sources, were these: "I would rather see the turban of the Sultan in the middle of the city than the Latin mitre." He preferred Ottoman conquest to Catholic religious influence. He made no secret of it. And in the context of Byzantine religious politics, he was not alone. Many Orthodox clergy and nobles felt the same. The wound of the 1204 Crusader sack of Constantinople had never healed. Western Christianity had betrayed Byzantium before. Why trust it now? The problem is what this attitude meant in practice. Constantine XI needed unity. He needed every resource, every fighter, every nobleman and ship captain and wall commander fully committed to the defense. What he got instead was a court divided, half committed to the union with Rome, half bitterly opposed, with Notaras leading the opposition. When the siege began in earnest in April of 1453, questions began to arise about Notaras's actual conduct. Byzantine sources, admittedly written with the benefit of hindsight and the bitterness of defeat, claimed that Notaras withheld resources during the siege, that naval equipment that should have been deployed was left in storage, that a Greek fire apparatus, the Byzantine Empire's most feared naval weapon, was never fully utilized because Notaras refused to release it from his control. Exaggerations may be exaggerated. They may reflect the need of survivors to explain an inexplicable defeat, but they are persistent. They appear in multiple independent accounts, and they point towards something real, a man who had calculated that Ottoman Constantinople was survivable in ways that an all-out defense of Byzantine Constantinople might not be. Notaras was protecting something: his wealth, his family, his position. He had done the same math the Venetians had done. He was wrong about one thing. He assumed Mehmed II would need him. He was wrong about that. The Ottoman siege of Constantinople began on April 2, 1453. It would last 53 days. In those 53 days, the defenders of Constantinople, outnumbered somewhere between 10-1 and 15-1, performed one of the great defensive actions in military history. The walls held. Again and again, the Ottoman artillery opened breaches, and again, the defenders repaired them under fire, fighting back assaults that should by every logic have overwhelmed them. The soul of the defense was Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese mercenary captain who had arrived in January with 700 soldiers and immediately taken command of the land wall defense. He was extraordinary. He seemed to be everywhere at once, directing repairs, rallying defenders, personally plugging gaps in the line when the Ottoman janissaries came over the walls. Constantine entrusted him completely. And then before dawn on May 29, 1453, Mehmed II ordered the final assault. Everything that happened in the next few hours has been argued about for centuries. The accounts contradict each other. The survivors were in shock. The Ottoman records were written by victors with their own story to tell. What we know is this. At some point during the final assault, Giustiniani was wounded. The accounts differ on how seriously. Some say it was a minor wound to the hand. Some say it was a devastating blow to the chest. What is not disputed is what happened next. Giustiniani asked Constantine XI for the key to a gate in the inner wall, a gate that would allow him to be carried to the harbor. Constantine, by all accounts, begged him not to go. He reportedly said words to the effect of, "The danger here is great, and you leaving will cause panic among the soldiers." Giustiniani went anyway. He took the key. He had himself carried through the inner wall, and his 700 Genoese soldiers, seeing their commander leave, broke from their positions on the most critical section of the wall and followed him. In the chaos that followed, the inner wall gate opened, the Genoese abandoning their posts, the defenders suddenly losing perhaps a third of their most experienced fighting strength. Someone left the Cercoporta open. The Cercoporta was a small postern gate in the outer wall. It had been used for sallies, small raids on the Ottoman lines. It should have been locked and barred after the last such sally. It was not. Ottoman soldiers found it. They poured through, and within minutes the Ottoman flag was flying from the towers above the gate. The city was lost before the sun was fully up. Not Farn. Constantine XI died fighting. That much seems certain even if the exact circumstances are not. He died not as an emperor trying to escape, not as a negotiator seeking terms, but as a soldier in the melee, his purple cloak abandoned so that he would not be recognized and captured. The body was never found. Giustiniani reached the Genoese colony on the island of Chios. He died there, of his wounds or of something else, within days. He never explained himself. He never wrote an account of what had happened. The question of whether his departure was cowardice, treachery, or simply the act of a mortally wounded man trying to live, that question was never answered. Loukas Notaras survived the fall of the city. Mehmed II initially spared him, apparently intending to use him in the administration of the new Ottoman Constantinople. Notaras was a man of enormous knowledge and capability. He would have been useful. A few days later, Mehmed changed his mind. Notaras was executed, along with his sons. The accounts differ on why. Some say Notaras refused to hand over his younger son for Mehmed's pleasure. Some say political enemies at the Ottoman court convinced Mehmed that Notaras was dangerous. Some say Notaras had simply become inconvenient, a man who knew too much about the fall of the city, about the open gate, about what had actually happened in those final hours. The men who could have told us the truth about the Cercoporta were all dead within weeks of the city's fall, and the Genoese colony of Galata, which had maintained its studied neutrality throughout the siege, immediately sent ambassadors to Mehmed II, congratulating him on his victory and asking to continue their trading privileges. Mehmed received them graciously. Commerce continued. There is a terrible clarity that comes from looking at the fall of Constantinople and asking a simple question: what would have been different if the betrayals had not happened? If the Pope had sent an actual crusade, not 3 ships, but the army he had promised, could Constantinople have been saved? Military historians are divided. The Ottoman army was enormous and well supplied, but a serious Western force arriving in the Bosphorus would have forced Mehmed to fight on two fronts simultaneously. It might have been enough if Notaras had released the Greek fire apparatus, if he had committed fully to the defense rather than calculating his own survival. Would the sea walls have held? Would the Ottoman navy have been driven back from the Golden Horn? Again, we cannot know, but the possibility is real. If Justiniani had stayed, wounded, exhausted, perhaps dying, would his 700 soldiers have held their section of the wall long enough for the breach to be repaired? On that narrow margin, on the question of a few hundred experienced soldiers in a critical position for perhaps an hour more, the entire fate of the empire may have turned. Nusk Injus in Bor, and the Kirkoporta, that small, forgotten gate, if someone, it does not even matter who, had remembered to lock it, would the final Ottoman assault have collapsed without that breakthrough? The city was exhausted. The Ottomans were also exhausted. There is a real argument that the final assault, which succeeded by the thinnest of margins, would have failed if not for that unlocked gate, Megua. The Byzantine Empire was not simply overwhelmed by superior force. It was undermined, inch by inch, by the choices of people who had decided that their personal survival was more important than collective defense. Megua. This is not a story unique to 1453. It is the story of every civilization that has ever collapsed. The walls are usually strong enough. The people inside them usually are not. Ho, ho, ho. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through the Western world that have still not fully subsided. Ho. The immediate effects were felt in trade. The Ottoman control of Constantinople meant Ottoman control of the primary land routes between Europe and Asia. Suddenly, the spice trade, the Silk Road, the routes through which the wealth of India and China reached European markets, ran through Ottoman-controlled territory. The cost of doing business with Asia exploded. Europe needed another way. Within 40 years of the fall of Constantinople, Christopher Columbus sailed west, looking for a sea route to India. Within 50 years, Vasco da Gama had found one, rounding the Cape of Good Hope. The Age of Discovery, the European expansion across the globe, the colonization of the Americas, the establishment of the modern world order, was triggered, at least in part, by the need to find a trade route that bypassed the Ottoman Empire. The fall of one city reshaped the entire planet, and the intellectual consequences were, if anything, even more profound. The Byzantine scholars who fled to Italy carried with them the treasures of classical antiquity, Greek texts, mathematical treatises, philosophical works that had been lost to Western Europe for centuries. These manuscripts ignited the Renaissance, the intellectual revolution that produced Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, Copernicus, and ultimately the scientific revolution, was seeded by the refugees of 1453. The greatest act of destruction in the medieval world produced the greatest intellectual flowering in human history, and none of it would have happened. The Age of Discovery, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the modern world, without the betrayal of a few men in a city on a peninsula between two seas, in the hours before dawn on a May morning more than 5 centuries ago. The weight of betrayal is not measured in the moment it happens. It is measured in everything that comes after. So here is where we are left. An empire that should have died centuries earlier, that survived through extraordinary stubbornness and the skill of its defenders. A set of allies who calculated their own interests and found the empire wanting. An internal establishment divided against itself at the worst possible moment. A wounded mercenary captain who chose to live, a gate that someone forgot or chose to leave open. And then silence. The flags coming down. The last emperor dead in the rubble. The greatest city in Christendom becoming the greatest city of the Ottoman world. Was it inevitable? Scholars will argue that forever. The power imbalance was real. The Ottoman military machine was formidable beyond anything the Byzantines could match. But inevitable is a word that history uses in hindsight. In the moments before dawn on May 29, 1453, the people on those walls did not feel the inevitability of anything. They felt fear and exhaustion and Some of them, the specific, corrosive weight of having trusted people who were not trustworthy. That weight is what this story is really about.